can definitely say that there are a lot of lessons that we can draw from the history of epidemics and pandemics that we could actually, should be, in fact, making use of already today. We now know that in the 14th century, beginning around the late 1340s, this plague bacteria begins to enter Europe, mostly through trade routes. Through trade routes, it starts to come into Europe in waves. And one of these first waves was in the mid to late 1340s. 75% of people in some areas succumb to the plague during that first, during the Black Death proper. The changes that it kind of unleashed in society were everything from cultural, societal, economic, political, just it absolutely transformed, in many ways, world history. Obviously, our understandings of the way contagion happened were completely different. We couldn't have known that it was caused by, that it came from the outside, so to speak, that it was caused by microorganisms, right, by bacteria or viruses. Instead, we believed that it could be caused by miasmas, by, like I said, this bad air. That could be caused by in a variety of ways. For example, the position of the stars, so it was very tied to astrological understandings. It was tied also to religion, to understandings of God, right? If people sinned, God would unleash his vengeful anger upon a society of human beings by unleashing these miasmas and causing disease. And yet, a lot of the measures that were put in place to protect populations of people from infection were not all that different from what we see today fundamentally. Quarantines have been in use since the beginning of the second plague pandemic in the 14th century. Quarantine, not just on for instance, a municipal level or regional quarantines, but also isolation within the home, the separating off of sick people from healthy people. one might guess that, well, everybody was afraid of it, obviously, right? Everybody was afraid of it. They stayed home, they prayed a lot, yet it's a lot more complicated than that. What we see is that, yes, there are those people who stay in and they're afraid for their lives. Unfortunately, as well, they should be, right? People who cling closer to their faith. But at the same time, there were those who took the YOLO approach, the you only live once approach. This idea that, well, everybody is quite literally dropping like flies around me. I'm probably next. I'm going to the pub. The invisibility of pandemics, of disease, lend quite a bit to the anxiety that it causes, right? And that's as true today as it was then. Called the Spanish flu, not because of really anything much to do with Spain at all. It was a global pandemic that took as many as 50 to 60 million lives globally. One of the things that we see took place during the 1918 pandemic is a lot of cities initially started to lock down, right? To ask people to wash their hands more frequently, to wear masks, to stay indoors where possible. And we see that there were, as we see today, people that were protesting these measures and people that were not willing to keep to them. There were those cities or regions that lifted the restrictions too soon. And what we see in those cases is that the numbers shot up exponentially, the number of cases, infections, and deaths, right? Hospitals were overwhelmed. And they needed, it basically just led to a longer, more drawn out disaster than what could have been if they had kind of stuck to it from the beginning, made the sacrifice up front. This was a period of time where only 100 years ago, 102 years ago, Philadelphia had carters going through the streets saying, "Bring out your dead." I mean, that's mind-blowing. That was 100 years ago. You would think that we would have learned a lot more from a disaster of that caliber that was that recent. And instead, what we find in disaster history in particular, something obviously that I work with, that I think about quite a bit, is that more often than not, people forget.